Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Board Gaming Doctor. My name is Phil, and I'll be your board game doctor today. In this video, I'm going to talk about Le Havre, the Inland Port. Now, two reasons why I want to talk about this game today and compare it to its parent game, Le Havre, is twofold, right? I had a comment from a viewer a couple of months ago, I think, who appreciated some of the comparison videos that I made for these spin-off two-player games of Rosenberg's that were, based off of popular games such as Agricola and Caverna. And so I wanted to continue that in light of that comment and do Le Havre, the Inland Port. Another reason why I wanted to do this now is because I recently just got back from vacation, wasn't really able to, play games regularly on Board Game Arena or otherwise, but I did have the app downloaded and figured it'd be a good time to re-engage with the game and explore it a little bit more in preparation to make a video about it and talk about the game itself and the comparisons of it to Le Havre. So let's get into it. Le Havre Inland Port is a game that was released in 2012, quite a few years ago. And in this game, you have, it's obviously a two-player game. You can also, I believe, play it solo. Nope, just kidding. You can only play it for two players. But what you're doing is reminiscent of, in Le Havre, you're trying to build out the best port that you can in Le Havre. And you do so in this game by utilizing a few mechanisms, which I will preface by saying that I think these mechanisms are pretty unique in the board games that I've played thus far and even have heard of. Like I don't feel like I've seen a lot of these mechanisms elsewhere. So first of all, to compare to Le Havre, you still are acquiring new buildings to place onto not on your own tableau, but on a shared board. This board serves as a track that determines the strength of a building when it is activated. You still have the ability to pay your opponent some money. It's relatively cheaper. Everything is worth a coin to use if it's someone else's building. But if it's further down the track, the more times you get to activate that building. And what these buildings revolve around mostly are the resources that you and your opponent are keeping track of on a grid. Now, this grid is probably the most unique thing about this game. It is a simple grid with columns and rows that help you keep track numerically of the resources, of which there are only 4: fish, grain, wood, and clay. But the way that the grid is set up is that, it goes, it progresses in numerical order. And I guess I should say the buildings, the way that it interacts with this grid is the most interesting thing. So when you spend resources, you can, spend them in a regular fashion where you subtract, like if a building costs 4 wood, for example, you would subtract the 4 wood from your grid. Now, you can do it in a couple of different ways. You can take 4 wood off if you go horizontally to the left 4 times, right? But the grid is set up in a way that if you move your marker diagonally down to the left, that's 4 resources right there. And if you go vertically down and spend resources that way, for each row that you progress down or regress, it's 3. And so a lot of this game is managing your resources and utilizing these buildings to move your resources up this grid, either horizontally or even diagonally, whether it's up to the left or up to the right, and vertically as well. There are a couple of buildings as well that require money to be purchased with, or food collectively with your fish and grain. There aren't any harvests in this game, as there is with Le Havre, the original game. And there are a couple of buildings as well that reward you for collecting and having a lot of a certain resource by the end of the game. And every round, to kind of simulate the worker placement, progression in a lot of Rosenberg games, where you progressively get more and more workers and can take more and more actions throughout the game. In this game, it is a static opportunity to, start the game with like 2 or 3 actions total that you get to take, and then that progresses up to 4 and then 5 or so. And that is static, right? It's not as fluid as other games like Agricola, where having to take the wish for children action, or whatever, the growth action, if you have room, of course, in your farm, that can happen at any time as long as that worker placement spot is open. And this is also in contrast to Le Havre as well, because in Le Havre you take 1 action per turn, whether it's gathering resources or activating a building, whether it's yours or someone else's, or even one that belongs to the market. The last bit of comparison for this game, in comparison to Le Havre itself, are the buildings. In this game, they are tiles, and in Le Havre, they are cards. The buildings in both games are, I should say, the base buildings in both games are set, right? You have a certain amount of buildings with the same types of buildings that will come out at a certain time. Meaning there are certain buildings that you'll see first in the first couple of rounds, and then others that will be reserved until later. The big point scoring buildings, for example. However, the stipulation is that in Le Havre, the parent game, you can at the start of the game arrange these buildings in numerical progression, and some of them will be in different columns as you align them into 3 different columns, right? And so there is a little bit of variation as to what buildings will come out during the game. In addition to that, there are special buildings. I believe there are 6 in the multiplayer game of Le Havre that you randomly can choose 6 of, and you will see throughout the course of the game as they are produced and shown to you throughout at certain points of the game, to add a little bit more variation to what might happen during the game. Now, in Le Havre, the inland port, the static buildings are going to be the same from game to game. There are no, extra buildings that you choose a certain amount of and leave like 2 or 3 out of the game to make the game feel a little different. So it's not even like a Fields of Arle type of variation where you switch out maybe 5 or 6 buildings. It's not even that. It's more like Ora et Labora, where all the buildings are the same and all of the buildings will come out at the same time, in the same rounds as you progress through the game. And so it's as chess-like as you can get, with the game itself being very static and being, with not a lot of luck or any luck at all. It really depends on who goes first and who goes second. But it all comes down to how you approach the game, with the knowledge of what buildings come when, and reacting to perhaps some of the strategies that your opponent might choose to do. So yeah, it's very much like a chess game with little luck, no luck, and all strategy. So when it comes to rating this game and my final comparison and thoughts compared to Le Havre itself, I give Le Havre Inland Port a 7 out of 10. I think this game plays pretty quickly for 2 players. It does take about a half an hour to play, especially if you know the rules and what's going on. I think there are a lot of strategies that you can pursue in this game. Knowing the buildings at the end of the game and what offers a lot of points, right? You have the building, the Pont de Normandie, that gives you like 30 points or 50 points if you have 30 coins to pay for it. You can really focus on gathering a lot of brick or wood, grain, etc. by the end of the game to have a lot of points that way, right? You can collect a lot of money versus trying to build as many buildings as you can to get a lot of points that way. And so I think for what it is, like for a 30-minute game, there are a lot of strategies to pursue. And something that I love, that I mentioned already, is the mechanism of the way that this grid works in terms of keeping track of your resources, but also how you spend them and how all the buildings interact with it. However, this game does lack in variability. It lacks the opportunity to surprise you with different combinations of buildings, with the fact that all the buildings are very static. there's a reason that I have a difficult time enjoying Or et Labora. And it's same here because I feel like it's hard to really replay this game over and over again. I guess there's no surprise factor that I get with a game of Agricola where there are different combinations of cards and strategies therein. And this is the same for Le Havre, right? I do give Le Havre, the parent game, a higher score because, yes, it is a longer game. It is more complex. It is deeper. There's a little bit of luck involved, but the sprinkle of special buildings in that game, as well as the variation in which buildings come out when, really creates an opportunity for strategy and a little bit of tactical play, and it rewards replayable. The opportunity to be replayable, right? So the Inland Port can be mastered, I think, and it does play very much like a chess-like game. And so you think of a lot of like abstract games that are static in its setup, and there's no randomness and no luck. And this game is that, with a lot of interesting mechanisms and somewhat thematic buildings as well. However, I guess, I don't know, if you're comparing this to chess itself, I think there are more opportunities for chess or a pure abstract game to contain a lot of different strategies to beat your opponent with, right? There's inherently more, I think, replayability in a game that is completely abstracted and has a lot of, chess is the perfect example of that type of game. And I think the Inland Port does a great job of adding like color and flavor to that type of game. And so it's a very abstracted game, but I guess because of that flavor and the coloring, with buildings and things like that, I think I expect it to be more like a Euro game where you have a variable setup, more buildings to choose from, that ultimately creates for a different experience every time. And I think that's just a preference of what I look for in a Euro game like this, and that's why I prefer Le Havre itself, right, versus the Inland Port. I feel like I get a lot more enjoyment in seeing what is there, as well as responding to it in hopefully a better way each time I play it, recognizing patterns and combos with the limited amount of variability. There's not a lot of variability in Le Havre itself, but kind of knowing some basic principles to approach that game with makes it fun, in addition to the variations that you get in what buildings come out when and what special buildings are available. Versus with Le Havre, the Inland Port, you don't have that opportunity. And so, if I did have someone who wanted to play this with a more dedicated repetition, I think I would enjoy that and really learn. But I think that learning curve ultimately also gets to a certain point where it plateaus quicker than a game like chess, right? I think that's that's what I'm trying to get across as well, is that I think the strategic learning curve plateaus a lot sooner, and you really start to understand what the best moves are, and it's really easy to telegraph what might happen next, and it becomes pretty rote pretty quickly. You don't have as many moving pieces as you do in a game like chess. And so I think the strengths of Le Havre, the Inland Port, are its mechanisms and its uniqueness in how it replicates the two-player, or in a two-player experience, the base game of Le Havre. I would rather play Le Havre at two players than I would the Inland Port, at its two-player specification. So, and it's for all the reasons that I've mentioned above. I think it is fun to at least try and play. I will say, in my experience too, I guess to note on the way that it might plateau. I mean, playing the game, I've played it online with some folks who are very good at this game, and of course, I think there is a lot to cover. I suppose, with more repetition, and maybe I can see the game lasting maybe 20 to 30 plays until I get there, if I really dedicated time to thinking about how this game plays, and obviously looking at the comments that other people have made and watching games, etc. And so it would only take like 20 to 30 games to, I think, really become a master of this game, if maybe being generous, right? There are certainly very smart individuals that would probably pick up on this game a lot quicker than I would. And so it doesn't have a lot of legs, essentially, to last either casually, playing this game with, other people or another person, just at random. I think the overview and the facade of this game having just the set amount of buildings really turns off the opportunity to just play this casually. And unless you play this like maybe once or twice a year, then it's totally fine, right? But then on the other hand, if you do want to play this game over and over again and become a master of it, I think it will not last as long as Le Havre would, or other big box games like Rosenberg's, or of other designers as well, because I don't think it would take as long to master this game. So for those reasons, I do appreciate and respect the uniqueness of the mechanisms of this game. The grid is fantastic, and I really like how these buildings interact with these different resources. Now, if this game perhaps had more buildings, but also some more resources to mess around with in order to produce more buildings and design space to allow for variation from game to game, that would definitely make this game more replayable and therefore more fun for me to replay it over and over again. But that's not the case, and since this game is over 10 years old, I doubt that this will have any additional material for it that I'm aware of, as Agricola, All Creatures Great and Small, and Caverna Cave vs. Cave have had in the last couple of years or so. So still an interesting experience. I think it's fun to try it out and kind of have this take on Le Havre itself. I would say out of the 3 games that I've mentioned so far, this one feels a lot less like the original game compared to the other 2. But it's unique enough to warrant, an experience or two, just to see what it's like. And I think it's really interesting too, where Rosenberg was probably at around this time in his game design, using games like this or at Labora, and then moving on to games like A Feast for Odin and Fields of Arle, which offer a lot less variability than Agricola did, but creating a game that is really chess-like and very little that has very little luck, right? And so I feel like he probably pushed a little too far into the more abstracted and less variation with games like this or at Labora, and then finally brought the needle back to a really comfortable middle ground when it came to A Feast for Odin and Fields of Arle. I think those games have a appropriate amount of variability while still balancing the approach of having a more chess-like experience with little variation when it comes to the actual gameplay. So it was really interesting to explore this game and kind of see the pathway that Rosenberg had taken in his design philosophies. So those are my thoughts on Le Havre the Inland Port and its comparison to Le Havre the base game. Thank you for consulting with me today, and I hope you schedule an appointment with me real soon. Take care.